It was discovered at that time Terry Bollea, also known as Hulk Hogan, was experiencing a serious medical-related issue.
On the morning of July 24, 2025, a 911 call came in from a home in Clearwater, Florida. The dispatcher's notes said cardiac arrest. Within minutes, paramedics from Clearwater Fire and Rescue were working on a 71-year-old man in his own house, doing chest compressions as he was wheeled toward an ambulance. Bystander video captured pieces of it, the kind of footage nobody wants to see because everybody already knew who lived at that address. By the time he reached Morton Plant Hospital, doctors were fighting a battle they would not win. He was pronounced dead that morning. His name, the one printed on his birth certificate in Augusta, Georgia, back in August 1953, was Terry Gene Bollea. The name the entire world knew him by was Hulk Hogan. Within the hour, the news had gone global. WWE posted a short statement calling him one of pop culture's most recognizable figures, a man who had helped the company achieve worldwide recognition back in the 1980s. Within the day, tributes were pouring in from every corner of the wrestling world and well beyond it. Ric Flair, Triple H, Charlotte Flair, John Cena, Dana White, Sylvester Stallone, even sitting political figures. Florida's governor would go on to declare a Hulk Hogan Day in the state. For a man who had spent nearly 5 decades building one of the most recognizable personas in the history of American entertainment, the outpouring made sense. What's more complicated, and far more interesting than any invented conspiracy, is the real story of his final months. Because in the weeks before his death, something was clearly happening to Hulk Hogan's body, and the full picture of what it was only came into focus after he was gone. This is that story, built entirely from what was actually reported, confirmed, and recorded. No invented FBI files, no secret rooms, no mystery phone calls. Just a 71-year-old man's body finally reaching the end of what it could survive, and the very real, very human questions that were left behind. To understand how Hulk Hogan died, you have to understand what 4 decades in a wrestling ring actually does to a human body, because Hogan was never shy about describing it. In a 2023 essay he wrote for Men's Health, he laid it out himself: knee replacements, hip replacements, shoulder surgeries, abdominal surgeries, eye surgeries. He said he'd lost track of the exact tally somewhere along the way. A year later, sitting across from Logan Paul on the Impulsive podcast, he put a number on it that stuck in the headlines for weeks afterward: 25 surgeries in the previous 10 years alone. 10 of those were on his back. Both knees replaced. Both hips replaced. Shoulders rebuilt. Nobody told me this gimmick stuff was fake, he joked, in that unmistakable rasp, half self-deprecating and half proud of what his body had absorbed on his behalf. He wasn't exaggerating for effect. Hogan had actually sued over some of that damage. Back in January 2013, he filed a $50 million medical malpractice suit against the Laser Spine Institute, alleging the clinic had talked him into a string of unnecessary spinal procedures, 6 operations in 19 months, that left his back worse off than before he'd started. He eventually had a more traditional spinal fusion in December 2010 that let him get back on his feet. That case is worth remembering, because it shows something important. This was not a man unfamiliar with spinal surgery gone wrong, or with fighting back legally when he believed a medical procedure had failed him. He had been down that road once already, over a decade before his death. By his own account, in that same 2023 essay, Hogan said he'd made real changes in his final years. He described cutting back on the pain medication that had piled up over years of chronic injury, swapping alcohol for CBD, and trying to get his inflammation and sleep under some kind of control. Friends and his wife described a man who trained regularly, meditated, and had found something closer to peace than he'd had in years. None of that erased what 4 decades of collision sport had done to his skeleton. It just meant he was managing it as best he could, one surgery at a time, well into his 70s. The chain of events that led directly to Hulk Hogan's death began roughly 10 weeks before he died, and at first, almost nobody outside his inner circle understood how serious it actually was. In early May 2025, Hogan appeared on Fox and Friends to promote a new business venture, a wrestling league he was building with his old WCW partner, Eric Bischoff, called Real American Freestyle Wrestling, with a launch planned for the end of August. Viewers immediately noticed something was off. Social media lit up with comments that he looked unwell, that something about his face and his manner seemed different from the Hogan people were used to seeing. Then, on May 14, 2025, Hogan went in for what his representatives described to TMZ as a little fusion procedure on his neck, something to help him feel a little better. His team said he was back at work within a day. It was framed, publicly, as almost routine. Just one more item on a list that already had 25 surgeries on it. It was not routine. What Hogan had actually undergone, as his wife Sky Daly would later explain in detail, was a 4-level anterior cervical discectomy and fusion, an ACDF procedure. To put that in plain terms, surgeons went into the front of his neck, removed damaged discs at 4 separate levels of his cervical spine, and fused the vertebrae together with hardware, typically titanium plates and screws, to stabilize the area. A single-level ACDF is already a serious operation. A 4-level fusion is a substantially bigger undertaking, involving a longer section of the spine, a longer recovery, and meaningfully higher surgical risk, especially in a patient in his early 70s with an already extensive surgical history. 4 weeks after the procedure, the public story stayed vague and, in hindsight, badly understated. Hogan didn't appear publicly. Rumors began to spread, first quietly, then loudly. Radio personality Bubba the Love Sponge, a longtime associate turned public critic of Hogan, began telling his audience that the situation was far more dire than anyone was letting on, at one point suggesting Hogan had suffered brain damage or was near death. Wrestling journalist Dave Meltzer said on his Wrestling Observer radio show in July that Hogan had obviously been in and out of the hospital. Hogan's representatives pushed back hard, telling outlets there was no reason to panic and that the surgery had gone well. Then, in early July, Sky Daly posted a detailed statement on Instagram that finally gave the public a clearer and considerably more alarming picture. She confirmed her husband was not in a coma and had not suffered brain damage, and said his heart was strong. But she also confirmed, in her own words, that the procedure had been a major 4-level anterior cervical discectomy and fusion, and called it an intense surgery with a long and layered healing process. She revealed that his recovery had involved his vocal cords, that he'd needed eating and breathing tubes during and after the procedure, and that he'd had multiple hospital stays over the following 6 weeks. This was, by any reasonable reading, a man who had gone through a serious, complicated surgical ordeal, not the little fusion procedure the public had first been told about. Here is the piece of the story that matters most, and it's grounded entirely in basic anatomy and the accounts of medical professionals who spoke publicly about Hogan's case after his death. Not speculation, not invented forensic drama. The cervical spine, the neck, houses nerve roots that do far more than let you turn your head. Several of the nerves that exit the spine in the C3 through C5 region combine to form the phrenic nerve, which travels down through the chest and controls the diaphragm, the primary muscle responsible for breathing. There's an old line taught in medical schools, repeated by more than one physician commenting publicly on Hogan's case afterward: C3, 4, 5 keep you alive, because that's the segment of the spine tied directly to the ability to breathe unassisted. A 4-level fusion in that region carries real risk to that structure and to the surrounding tissue. Surgeons commenting publicly on Hogan's case after his death, without direct access to his medical file, but drawing on general surgical knowledge of ACDF procedures, laid out how a case like this can deteriorate. During a multi-level fusion, hardware is placed to hold the spine stable while a bone graft slowly fuses the vertebrae together over months. Until that graft solidifies, the screws and plates are doing all the structural work. If that hardware loosens, shifts, or fails, something that becomes more likely the more levels are fused and the more strain is placed on the neck too soon during recovery, it can destabilize the area, cause internal bleeding, or put pressure on nearby nerves and the airway. Damage or compromise to the phrenic nerve specifically can suppress the diaphragm's ability to function properly, reducing how well a person is able to breathe, sometimes without dramatic, obvious warning signs beforehand. That matters enormously here because of what else was true about Hogan's body. According to his official cremation approval report, obtained by multiple outlets from the Pinellas County Forensic Science Center, Hogan had a documented history of atrial fibrillation, a chronic irregular heart rhythm, and chronic lymphocytic leukemia, a cancer of the blood and bone marrow. Both conditions independently raise the risk of a serious cardiac event. Combine either of them with even a partial drop in oxygen levels caused by impaired breathing, and you have the physiological recipe for exactly the kind of sudden, catastrophic cardiac arrest that killed him. None of this is confirmed as the definitive mechanical chain of events. No medical examiner's report has stated that the surgery caused the heart attack, and no lawsuit outcome has established it in court. What is confirmed is this: Hogan's cause of death was listed as acute myocardial infarction, a heart attack, on a report certified by his primary care physician and obtained by ABC News. The report explicitly noted his history of atrial fibrillation and chronic lymphocytic leukemia as contributing factors. And it happened just over 2 months after a major, complicated neck fusion that his own wife described as far more serious than the public had initially been told. What makes this timeline so hard to fully reconcile is that Hogan, by multiple accounts, did not look or act like a man in freefall during those final weeks, at least not consistently. Sky Daily's July statement insisted his heart was strong and that he was recovering. Friends described him attempting to ease back into light training. There were photos of him out and about, greeting fans outside his Clearwater property, looking upright and engaged. His son Nick spoke about his father being more focused on his health in that period than he had been in years. This is a genuinely difficult thing to hold in your head at the same time as the picture Sky Daily herself painted just weeks earlier. Vocal cord involvement, breathing tubes, repeated hospital stays. Both accounts are real. Both were said by people close to him. The truth, as it usually is with a body recovering from major trauma at 71, was probably not a straight line. Some days he likely did feel close to normal. Others, clearly, he did not. What we don't have to speculate about is what happened on July 24th. The 911 call came in reporting cardiac arrest. Paramedics arrived and immediately began resuscitation. He was transported to Morton Plant Hospital, where doctors continued working to revive him. At 11:17 that morning, he was pronounced dead. Because Hogan was who he was, the case did not close quietly the way a typical natural death does. The Clearwater Police Department later confirmed publicly that, given his profile and the circumstances, investigators felt an obligation to look more closely than they otherwise might have. They interviewed multiple witnesses. They reviewed recordings and available records. This was, in the department's own words, about validating and addressing the concerns swirling around the case, not because anything at the scene pointed toward a crime, but because a death this high-profile demanded diligence and a clear public accounting. Nearly a year later, in June 2026, the Clearwater Police Department released its statement on the case. Their conclusion was direct. The death was classified as an attended natural death. Investigators stated plainly that nothing about the scene was suspicious and that no foul play was involved. There was no FBI investigation into a homicide. There was no disabled security system, no hidden room, no untraceable phone call from 3 days before his death. Those details do not appear in a single verified news report, police statement, or court filing connected to this case, because they never happened. What actually took place was a standard, if unusually publicized, review by local police that ended in a natural death ruling, consistent with the cremation report's finding of a heart attack layered on top of pre-existing atrial fibrillation and leukemia. Hogan's personal life had never been simple, and that didn't change at the very end. His first marriage, to Linda Claridge, began in 1983 and produced his 2 children, Brooke and Nick. 4 years, especially through the mid-2000s run of the reality show Hogan Knows Best, the family was presented to the public as a tight, if chaotic, unit. That image cracked in 2007 amid infidelity allegations, and Linda filed for divorce that same year, ending a marriage of roughly 24 years. Hogan later spoke candidly about how hard that period was for him, describing real struggles with depression in its aftermath. He remarried in 2010 to Jennifer McDaniel in a much lower-profile ceremony. That marriage ended quietly in 2021. His third marriage, to yoga instructor Sky Daily, came in 2023, and by all accounts from people close to the couple, it brought him a genuine sense of calm in his final years. His relationship with his daughter Brooke had grown distant well before his death, shaped by years of public controversy that had touched the whole family, including the fallout from a widely publicized leaked recording years earlier that damaged Hogan's public standing for a long stretch of his later career. After his death, Brooke publicly addressed the strain directly, sharing an emotional tribute that spoke to what she called a sacred bond with her father while acknowledging that their relationship had not been simple. It was a real, human, complicated grief, not evidence of a hidden family conspiracy, just the plain reality that families, even famous ones, don't always heal cleanly before it's too late to try. Hogan was laid to rest on August 5, 2025, in a private funeral in Clearwater. Pallbearers wore yellow boutonnieres, a quiet nod to the ring gear that had defined so much of his public identity. Triple H and former WWE co-CEO Stephanie McMahon were among the attendees, alongside musician Kid Rock and comedian Theo Von. 2 days later, WWE aired a tribute on SmackDown, with Triple H narrating a package that called Hogan the ultimate hero and told the crowd he had died at home, surrounded by family. The audience responded with a chant of his name. It's worth stepping back, because the medical details of Hulk Hogan's final months, however serious, were never the reason the entire world stopped to take notice of his death. Terry Bollea spent nearly 50 years building the version of himself the world knew as Hulk Hogan, and in doing so, he changed what professional wrestling was capable of being as mainstream entertainment. He broke into wrestling in 1977, and by the early 1980s, he was the face that carried the then WWF out of regional territories and into something closer to a global media business. He headlined the first 8 WrestleManias. His 1984 title win over the Iron Sheik at Madison Square Garden is still treated as one of the sport's foundational moments, and his 1988 body slam of Andre the Giant at WrestleMania 3 remains one of the most replayed images in the history of the genre, a piece of footage that people who have never watched a full wrestling match still instantly recognize. He was a 6-time WWF/WWE World Champion, inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame twice, first individually in 2005 and again in 2020 as part of the NWO. When he turned heel and joined the New World Order at Bash at the Beach in 1996, he reshaped what a wrestling storyline could look like for an entire era that followed. His reach went well beyond the ring. He starred as Thunderlips in Rocky III in 1982, hosted his own Saturday morning cartoon, released a Billboard charting album, and became a genuine reality television fixture through Hogan Knows Best in the mid-2000s. Performers who came along after him, Dwayne Johnson among the most prominent, have said openly that the mainstream stage Hogan built made their own careers possible in the first place. He was also, without question, a divisive figure by the time he died, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty. The leaked recording controversy from the mid-2010s cost him his standing with WWE for years before a partial reconciliation. His outspoken political turn in his final years, including a fiery, shirt-ripping speech at the 2024 Republican National Convention, made him, for some fans, as much a lightning rod as a nostalgia act. Multiple retrospectives written after his death noted plainly that he left behind what one outlet called an extremely complicated legacy. That complexity was part of the real story too, and it doesn't need any invented conspiracy to make it compelling. So here is the honest version of what happened to Hulk Hogan, built entirely from what was reported, confirmed, and documented, without a single invented detail. A man in his early 70s, carrying the accumulated damage of nearly 5 decades in one of the most physically brutal forms of live entertainment ever built, along with a documented history of atrial fibrillation and chronic lymphocytic leukemia, underwent a major 4-level cervical spine fusion in May 2025. What his team first described to the public as a minor procedure turned out, by his own wife's later account, to be a serious surgery involving his vocal cords, breathing and eating tubes, and multiple hospital readmissions over the following weeks. 10 weeks later, he suffered a fatal cardiac arrest at home. His official cause of death was recorded as a heart attack, with his existing heart and blood conditions listed as contributing factors by his own physician. Local police, given the scale of public attention on the case, conducted a formal review and ultimately closed it as a natural death with no evidence of foul play, a conclusion they stated publicly nearly a year later. There was no FBI investigation into a suspicious death. There was no hidden room, no disabled security system, no untraceable phone call. Those elements belonged to invented internet content that spread in the wake of his death, the kind of embellished, algorithm-friendly storytelling that tends to attach itself to any sufficiently famous person's passing. The real story doesn't need any of that. A 71-year-old man's body, pushed through decades of extraordinary physical punishment and a major surgery it likely couldn't fully absorb, finally gave out. That is tragic and human enough on its own, and it's the version of events that actually happened. What lingers, honestly, isn't a mystery in the conspiratorial sense. It's the ordinary, unresolved messiness that surrounds almost any death, especially one that comes with this much fame attached. There's the surgery itself, and the open question of whether a 4-level fusion at his age, on top of everything else his body was carrying, was the right call in the first place, a question his medical team, his family, and possibly future legal proceedings may still have to answer more fully than the public record currently does. There's the strain with his daughter that never got the chance to fully resolve. There's a public legacy that swings, depending on who's asked, between the man who built modern wrestling and a deeply complicated figure whose controversies never fully faded. None of that requires inventing anything. Terry Bollea lived a genuinely dramatic, oversized American life, and he died the way a lot of people his age with his medical history eventually do, worn down by decades of accumulated damage, undone in the end by a major surgery his body had to absorb on top of everything else. The tributes were real. The grief from people who actually knew him was real. And the questions his family and doctors are still quietly working through about that final surgery are real too. They just don't need a secret basement room to be worth asking.